Hello, this is Salvatore coming to you from within the shadows of the everlasting hills. Just want to talk about a couple things on a video tonight. Normally I wouldn't want to do it this way without my great sound equipment and a good camera and everything, but sometimes you just have to do things at night when you have the will to do them, you have the energy and the time, and I just felt like talking about a couple issues. I want to make a series of videos about various topics. I started back in November with the centenary anniversary of the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb. And I want to talk about some philosophical, religious, maybe even political things on this channel. And I say maybe political because my view of politics is very non-partisan. The way I view current events and the way I view politics, I think, is more of a scholarly approach. I'm registered as an independent voter, and I am interested in political history and in political debate, but I tend to distance myself from actually joining a party and campaigning. Now, that's an invitation to all of you great folks out there who are wanting to get into politics. And I have some friends that are very ambitious in Utah, you know who you are, about entering serious politics. When I see a candidate I love, and someone who I think is a great leader, and who espouses good things, I certainly will vote for them. I am a very active voter. So when I say, that I'm nonpartisan in politics, that does not mean that I'm not a very active voter, because I am. It just means that I don't think, even though I do believe that the two-party system has done great things for America, it allows, if you don't have to have a coalition government, which the parliamentary model, for example, sort of requires that you form a coalition in a multi-party system. If you're not hampered by that and you have two parties and you can sort of get things done with a simple majority, there is an advantage sometimes to that. And there's also a disadvantage. Sometimes things should not be done quickly and precipitously. So I do think we've gained from that system, but I also think there are dangers in that system. And I try to keep myself at a studious distance to try to analyze the issues and political history with as little prejudice as I possibly can. And of course I have my biases. We all have that. But I'm just striving to analyze things in not such a black and white way. And I've realized that in my study of history and culture and many other things, as long as we think that we have to find the good guy and the bad guy, we always come up against a wall in our analysis. Because at some point we're going to have to be a little dishonest with ourselves. We're going to say, oh, I found this, but I don't want to be a turncoat at this point. I want to stick faithfully to my idea of who's right and who's wrong, and so we hamper ourselves. We put a governor. And if we can somehow take that off and just say, the history of humanity, the history of politics is ambivalent. The good guy becomes the bad guy becomes the good guy. There is no good guy, there is no bad guy. It's very complex. And so I try to analyze things more in that way. Now, that was tangential to kind of the main points I wanted to make, but I wanted to explain that if anyone ever wants to, and I'm making these mostly for my own record, but if anyone ever wants to explore what I'm presenting here, you're not really ever going to get a very partisan political spiel from me. This is never going to be about we in the Democratic Party, we in the Republican Party. It's never like that. It's more of a scholarly, historical approach. And I love that. I love that way of looking at politics. For example, saying, analyzing presidential history, saying a president was really good in this area and a president was really bad in this other area. And I have a lot of family members and friends who are just almost hagiographic in their analysis of certain presidents. If it's a president they liked who's a member of their party, they did everything right, and so forth. So, again, a bit of a tangent, but I kind of wanted to lay that foundation for any future videos that have a little bit of political content. But what I'm much more interested in is philosophical and religious discussions. And of late, I've been very active on YouTube in commenting on philosophical and religious videos. And it's very interesting because YouTube has been out since 2006, I believe it was. We can check that later. But I never had an interest in internet commenting or sort of getting into that space for many years. And I didn't even get a social utility at all of any kind until 2016. And I kind of found my niche with art history and music, and I have found that social media is actually great for that. I'm also kind of a fledgling member of the YTPC, which is the YouTube pipe smoking community. So I do like tobacco pipes, and there's this kind of wonderful thriving community on YouTube talking about that, and many other communities about many other topics, everything that you can think of. But recently, in the last maybe year and a half, I've become much more interested and much more active in commenting on videos. And the reason I do it is because I strongly believe in vigorous debate about ideas. Unfortunately, in our society, we have a lack of courtliness, a lack of civility. And I don't believe in making ad hominem attacks. I'm not interested in that at all. But I am interested in attacking ideas and vigorously debating ideas, because I firmly believe that our worldview should be based on reason, and should be based on rational thought, as much as we have the power to make it so. And now someone might say, but your way of thinking, your way of analyzing is very different from someone else's. And of course that's true. But there are sort of accepted standards of rational thought. There are accepted standards of critical thinking. And I think that those are wonderful to apply. In my last video, I talked about a wonderful Egyptological discovery that has meant so much to me. And over the years, the analysis of that great work and that great discovery has shifted, will continue to shift. Opinions will change. But I think we can say safely that it's usually been done as scientifically as possible, using logic, using reason, using evidence-based thinking. So that's just an example of something where, yes, opinions can change. Because I've heard this critique of science many times, that, well, science will be different in a few years. But actually, if you look at it, science is more of an aggregation of thought. Very seldom now in science are findings made that actually strip out the entire foundation of what we know to be true. It's more that we are adding layers. And so I think logic and reason are so important. Now, on this channel before, I have posted videos talking about my faith journey. And I do want to talk about more about that because it's extremely important to me. I will say that it may be a little delicate for some people, for family and friends, because I know that sometimes when someone attacks ideas in our faith, it feels like they're attacking us. And I never want to do that. I have no interest in attacking individuals and their religious choices, but I do vigorously attack ideas. And so I will attack, talking about my faith journey. Sometimes I will vigorously oppose certain religious ideas and things that I was, brought up thinking, and those will get attacked. And so I say it's delicate because, again, I never want family and friends to feel unsafe or offended. And I hope that I have earned their trust as a friend. I hope they'll know that I'm never going to call them up and say, you're not worth my time because we think differently. Because that's not at all how I approach philosophy and religion. Now, is there a spectrum of things I admire in religion? Definitely so. I was raised in a high demand situation, and there are principles that I was taught that I still greatly admire, that I don't think will ever leave me, because when you have that strong foundation, I just don't know that there's anything that can sort of quash that out of you. It's just going to continue with you. And I'm a great admirer of many different religions. But I think because of the high demand upbringing, I do tend more towards orthodoxy. I wish part of me wishes I can convert to Judaism, because I'm a lifelong admirer and love many of the tenets of Judaism, and probably admire many of them because, for example, in Judaism, the community is so important. And I grew up in a high demand orthodoxy where it was all about the community and our shared history and our shared values. And as many other people have said, secularism doesn't know how to do that very well. Secularism has not figured out how to manufacture community and provide it in the way that religion has. Do I think it's possible for a humanistic society to achieve that? I actually really do. I think that we have shared values and shared humanity that can bring people together in a similar way to religion, but I just think we haven't figured it out yet. We don't know the secret sauce. We don't have the formula, the way religion has been so successful in doing that. And I suppose my critique of religion has very little to do typically with the community aspect. I think that's a wonderful aspect. I think thought control, morality control, behavioral control, false narratives, invented scripture, those kinds of things, that is where I'm a little bit more rancorous in my critiques of religion. So I just want to lay the foundation for that, because I do want to continue with a series of videos where I discuss religion. I especially want to talk about some recent events that are going on in the world today, with the LDS Church specifically, and the SEC, and also the SVB banking crisis, which I've always found macroeconomics to be fascinating. And I'm not an economist, I'm not an expert. I took a college level economics course when I was getting my degree, but I'm far from expert, but I just love to talk about these issues, And I do want to do a very comprehensive video coming up about the SEC and the LDS Church. And I know it's going to be sensitive for some people, but I do wish I had, also I invite those who wouldn't be interested, just don't watch it. But if you are interested, I would highly encourage it. I wish I had done it, a week and a half ago, when the issues were very, very fresh. But again, I was waiting for the opportunity to use my little studio I have in the office and the great equipment and all of that, and it just passed me by. Sometimes if you wait for that perfect opportunity, it just never appears. So rather than do that, I thought, okay, just get going, just get recording on this series that you want to do, and that'll encourage you to push forward and do more. Sometimes that first step, it's just hard, and I sort of have some about film and video, especially because of who my father is and how I was raised. I have some high expectations about how those things should look, so I'm frustrated when it's low quality. But it's the ideas that I really want to sort of tease out and get talking about. So just sort of as a teaser for that next video, what happened with the SEC and the LDS Church? And in just a few words, very simply, the LDS Church is like any organization with a great deal of money invested in the market. It is required, when that money is above a certain margin, certain amount, is required to file paperwork with the SEC, 13F forms that explain what those assets are. And the church in the late 90s formed an investment advisors group under the umbrella of the church called Ensign Peak LLC to manage its wealth, which was already by the late 90s very considerable, but is now gigantic. I mean, estimated at over $200 billion. That's not just part of that is in the American stock market. Over 200 billion is the estimation of everything that the LDS Church has. And again, it's gigantic. It was already large in the 90s. The church decided it was going to use Ensign Peak to manage its wealth. Over the next few years, as they realized they were going to have to file 13F forms that were going to reveal the size of the wealth, they decided to create shell companies. They decided to create separate entities to divide the church's holdings, to divide the wealth, so that they would not have to report the aggregate amount. That would have been perfectly legal if the church had moved assets, actually moved them to those smaller entities, and given the managers of those entities, plenary authority to actually make investments and make decisions about the investments. If they'd done that, it would have been perfectly legal. The problem is, again, they were shell companies. They were fake companies with obfuscatory names. In the next video, talk in a little bit more detail about that, with names that could not be connected back to headquarters in Salt Lake. And this is all public information that's in the SEC settlement with the church. None of this is speculative. This is all in the SEC order, and I would encourage everybody to read that. I think a lot of people have read the LDS Church's news release, which doesn't give very much detail, but actually go to the SEC, go to their order, and you will see an unusually large, usually these SEC settlement documents are pretty short, but this is a long one with a lot of detail. And so none of this, as I say, none of this is speculative, but the shell companies were created to hide the amount of wealth that the church possessed, the amount of securities in which it had invested. And Roger Clark, who used to run Ensign Peak, several years ago told the Wall Street Journal that the primary reason that was done was because the church was afraid that if its members knew the amount of wealth that the church had access to, they would stop paying offerings. And I'll explain a little bit. I've lived in Utah for many years, so I'm not very good at explaining. Almost everyone I know is in the LDS sphere, and so sometimes I forget to explain basic things, and I'll get out of that habit. But in the LDS Church, 10% of a person's income is commanded in LDS theology by the Lord to be given to the church. Your tithe, your 10%. In some of the Romance languages, that idea of the 10 is built into the word. In Spanish, for example, the word is diezmo. And the diezmo is the 10%, and that dies, that 10 is in the word. But they, according to Clark, as I said, the concern from senior leadership was that people would not pay their tithing if the full extent of the wealth was known. And there are lots of other reasons for it, and I'll go into all the complexity in another place. But this has really resonated with a lot of people. And again, in my background, I have undergone a faith transition. I'm no longer active in the LDS Church, though many of my most beloved people in my life are. But again, I think the SEC settlement, the shell companies, it has really resonated with a lot of people, and a lot of people who are still active in the church. And they're bothered by this because the perception is, again, that Christ was the suffering servant of the poor who had nowhere to lay his head. And sort of conservative Christianity today, and even progressive Christianity, has fallen very far. The image has become almost unrecognizable from that mystic suffering servant. Now it's white collar, establishment, wealthy, powerful. The organizations have become huge and wealthy, and again, they are just very far from the image of Christ. And I think that really bothers people. Now, that's a common theme in history, where some activist will appear in history, some individual, and they'll make a huge change and they'll make an impact, but they'll be modest and humble, and then their ideas get appropriated and used by massive hierarchies who, again, have their principles somewhere in the core, but they become almost unrecognizable. And that just happens in history over and over and over again. In the history of the United States, for example, from a little group of colonies that came together to create an independent government, they were the activists. They were the little think tank that kind of changed the world and fought against the establishment. But what has the United States become? It's become this, behemoth, this wealthy. So, and I'm not saying that it's always that those organizations that spring up are necessarily evil. I'm just saying that they blur. The original principles tend to get blurred and harder to access when you really get down to the root. And that was part of my faith journey, as I really dug into my own Christianity and saw the purity and the simplicity. I felt like the hierarchy and the organization of the church, the LDS Church, was just far from that beauty and that simplicity. And I used to preach over the pulpit. I was once an LDS church leader in a bishopric and had many other callings. I used to preach over the pulpit. As you come to get to know the organization of the church and the structure of the church, you'll come to know Jesus Christ. But as I continued, I found that to be, for me, not the case. I found it to be far from the man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. So, and I don't know the answer to that. I don't know how I'm not proposing an answer. But I know now that to enjoy the beauty of Christianity for me, which I'm still very attracted to, Christian iconography and imagery, for me, the organization was detracting from that. And there's a lot more beauty for me without all of that. But the organizations are useful too, in their own way. They can do a lot to help people. So I don't have a good answer, but I want to, in these videos, I want to talk a lot more about this topic. The relationship between religious dogma, tradition, history, hierarchy. I want to talk about all of that because it's all very fascinating to me. And again, just to be clear, for people who stumble on these videos, all I have is a classics major. I'm not so I studied ancient Greece and classical Rome. So I have a really good foundation for philosophy. I took a lot of religion classes in college and all that, but I am not, a theologian. I'm not an expert, but I just want to have conversations about these topics. And I want to, and I think when you start talking, it gets your mind motivated to learn more and to want to gain more wisdom about the things that really interest you. So I want to talk about all that. I want to do a long video about the SEC and kind of go into more detail because that very much interests me. And again, some macroeconomic things that are going on right now that are fascinating to me because I was in college taking an economics class in 2008 when the last very major crash happened. And a lot of the rhetoric at that time was similar to what we're hearing now. Paulson telling the press, trust in the banking system, and that's kind of what we're hearing now. And the difference is just what will occur, what path will things take. I'm fascinated by the bind that the Federal Reserve is in because they've been wanting to raise interest rates to cool the economy, to try to keep this inflationary state that we're in under control. But now they're in a position where they want to support the banks. And cranking interest rates up is obviously not the way to do that. You don't want to make it more expensive to be a bank. So it's a difficult issue. And the United States and its government and its institutions are an experiment. And so many people think they have the perfect idea about how all of this should work. But the Federal Reserve is still an experiment. And there are those that rail against it and say it's unconstitutional and it shouldn't be there. And there's other people that say things should be so much more highly regulated than they are. And unfortunately, the financial system so far, a lot of what we've done is we've tried different things. They lead to disaster, and then we adjust. I mean, before 2008, bundling mortgages into these big securities, these toxic mortgages into these big securities, and selling them became disastrous. And these, default swap deals that they had going, just disastrous. So, that was tried. Those things were tried. And they depended on certain firms never failing. Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers. And we found out that, subprime mortgage securities were a really, really bad idea. Before 1929, of course. I mean, hardly anything was regulated. This was the era of, hey, let me set you up. Trust me, this stock in, Schmobby Dobby pet food company or whatever, it's just going to go up and up and up. The idea was people just thought, and it makes sense, I mean, from one vantage point, that the value of securities would never, it would do nothing but increase. And there's a lot of opinions about the Great Depression, and it's very controversial. To my mind, a problem was the disconnect between commodities, actual real commodities like wheat and corn, and financial markets. Like there was such a big disconnect, and it was like this imaginary financial market is just going to keep increasing in value. And that's kind of similar to what happened before 2008 too, where people thought the price of housing is never going to go down. It's just going to keep going up no matter what. And so we're safe. And so, again, it's kind of trial and error. And that's really unsatisfactory, because I think we want to always prevent disaster. We always want to prevent accidents and bad decisions. But it's not always possible. You can do your very, very best to prepare, and you can still have a disaster. I mean, the strongest dikes and levees and everything and dams will, can fail. Is that some kind of nihilistic viewpoint? No, absolutely not. I think we can learn from the past. We can use good judgment, and we can do our very best to make sure that disaster doesn't strike. We can try, and we'll do a lot of good. But never think you can't be surprised. I mean, there's been many things that I thought were settled, for example, in American politics, that have proven not to be. I thought that the Roe versus Wade precedent, that the Supreme Court decided on in 1973, I thought that was going to stand for all time. I never thought I'd live to see the day where a Supreme Court would challenge the stare decisis on that. And we can talk about the constitutional interpretation of all of that in a future video. By bringing that up, I'm not telling you my opinion, but I just brought it up to say that's something that I thought would never change. I thought it was completely settled. I never thought that people in the United Kingdom would vote to leave the European Union, because it was a settled reality in my mind. But I learned, don't ever expect that. You do not know what people will vote for, what they'll choose. And in people's lives too. A lot of people who I've talked to about my faith transition are really shocked. It's like, oh, you were a church leader. You were part of, the establishment in the church. You clearly loved it. Loved to teach and preach and participate. And the music, of course, is what kept me in longer than anything else. Participating in church music. So it's so surprising that you've left. But again, never be surprised. Because we just don't know. We just don't know what people are going to decide. So maybe part of one of the misconceptions that I want to handle in my videos as I talk in these conversations, one of the misconceptions is that we've moved to a certain point in the story of humanity where certain things are assured. Because I thought that as a little kid. Because the way things were kind of taught to me in school was, we used to have smallpox, we used to have measles more, and we've eradicated all of that. We don't deal with this or that anymore. United States, we have clean water, we have great health care. It was just sort of, in my childhood, I kind of accepted those things. But then came to realize, especially as I lived in one of the poorest countries in the world for 2 years of my life, I came to realize that nothing is assured, that it can all change. And so we have to be constantly using the lessons we have learned. We can't think that chapter of history is closed, there's nothing more to do there. No, keep the history alive. Keep using it to make great judgment calls. And anyway, I want to talk more about going forward. 20th century history, how it's influencing what's happening right now. 21st century history and how I think it may influence the future. So, again, anyone who's interested, please watch these. I don't think they're going to interest a lot of people, but I want to make a record. I want to take all of the interest that I have in art and music and history and literature and all of those things, and I want to just do something with it as far as a conversation with a little bit broader audience. I have great conversations about these things with close friends and family and my wonderful wife, but I'd like to just kind of put more out there, and that's kind of what we're doing in 2023. We've kind of learned now, to me, YouTube, and this is why I'm choosing YouTube, and I'll link these through Instagram, but I'm choosing YouTube because to me, in 2023, YouTube is everything that television had the potential to be, but not the technology to be in 1950. Television, only a very few people, wealthy organizations, could broadcast in 1950. And it was very difficult and very expensive, and the technology was very cumbersome. And it wasn't until about 15 years into the game that everyone kind of decided, okay, let's do color, which had been harder and expensive. But in 2023, anyone can broadcast. And I just want to emphasize that. Anyone can broadcast. My channel doesn't have the algorithmic advantages that, let's say, the big three networks have. Their YouTube channels are huge with millions of viewers, and then of course the influencers who have these massive social media and YouTube presences. I don't have the algorithmic advantages to that, but I have the same space, and that's what YouTube has done for the world, and I am so admiring of that. And it took a long time to figure that out. For the first few years, it was all cat videos and Charlie bit my finger and people jumping into the pool, and those are all great. I don't mean to denigrate. I mean, it's wonderful to be able to see what humanity's doing on the other side of the globe in their daily lives. But philosophy, religion, discussions about how to alleviate poverty and suffering, and I'll talk in my next video maybe about some of my favorite channels and content, but the level of intellectualism and the quality of programming is incredible now on YouTube. And again, it's everything that television should always have been. And there are even ways around the monetization. I mean, someone has to, pay for these creators to do what they're doing. But with premium subscriptions, you don't even have to watch, the barrage of advertisements that were always part of TV and have been part of online video viewing. So I think it has enormous potential, and I think we're just scratching the surface, and it's going to continue to do wonderful things. And the fact that I can watch any film that I want, on Apple TV or other apps like that, the fact that the whole world is in our pocket is just an amazing thing. But what I worry about is that our brains will move to our pocket too, and I never want to see that happen. Because I grew up in a time just on the cutting edge of when the internet was beginning, where if you had a fact that you needed to know, it's like, unless you were going to go to the library, it's just like, well, I better call so-and-so because I think they know about this. And then you get the answer from that person. Whereas now we can just look it up instantly. But I still think trivia and facts are so important. So let's just keep putting things in our brains. And that's why I want to supply this kind of content. Because it's coming from the things that deeply, deeply interest me, that I've deeply read about and studied and thought about. So those are my thoughts that I have on this late night. It's March of 2023. I want to thank you for listening. There'll be more content for any who are interested, and I want to wish everyone a wonderful night.